Connie, I hear a lot of educators talk about a term called forms and functions,
Yes.
and I just want to know why that is so important in helping a English language learner succeed in the classroom.
Okay. Again, we can go back to that representation of language, the language pie, and we're looking at those two wedges in that pie that referred to use of language and forms. When we talk about using language, we're actually talking about how we use language. What kind of a function do we want language to serve as we use it? When we open our mouths and language comes out, it always has some kind of a purpose. We're using it for a reason. We may be using it in a social context where we're just asking a social question, or perhaps we are issuing a command, maybe we're describing something, perhaps we're narrating something, or we're telling something to someone that someone told us. So these oftentimes are referred to as the functions of language, the social functions of language, which students acquire before they really develop what we call the academic functions of language. The academic functions of language are more sophisticated. We're asking, when we use the academic functions, we're asking students to do something like compare and contrast, to describe in much greater depth, to hypothesize, to opinionate, to summarize, to grasp the main idea. So it's an academic function of language that we're talking about, being the other dimension. Now, interestingly enough, we cannot perform a function of language unless we have some tools inside of it. The tools are the grammar. So it's the grammar forms that enable us to execute the functions, to carry out the functions. Let me just give you an example. If, in fact, you wanted to describe something, you would not be able to describe what's on that table over there unless you were able to use some form of the verb to be, because you want to say there is and there are. So in addition to that, you also would have to know the plural marker. For example, you would have to know how to pluralize singular nouns, because there are two bottles on that table over there. In addition to that, if one bottle belonged to someone, you would have to know the possessive marker. You would have to know how to say Joe's bottle, or his bottle, or Linda's book. And so when you perform the social function of describing, you have to know also the grammatical forms that are embedded in those social functions. Let me give you an example of an academic function. If I asked you to compare and contrast, because these bottles are different that are on the table, you wouldn't be able to compare and contrast unless you knew the difference between the comparative and the superlative. For example, one of the bottles is bigger than the other, or one of the books is thicker than the other. But of the three books, one of them, the dictionary, is the thickest. So that's what we mean by the forms being embedded in the functions. And the academic functions, the grammatical forms inside of academic functions, are usually much more complicated, much more complex. And the language structures in which that you're using with academic functions are longer and they're more sophisticated.
Connie, correct me if I'm wrong, it appears to me that forms and functions is an essential building block to ultimately becoming English language proficient. Is that true?
Definitely, because students have to learn how to use language for a variety of purposes in both social and academic contexts. And in addition to that, they have to be able to use that language with grammatical accuracy. And so this is what makes ELD instruction today very distinct, because we are actually highlighting those functions of language that we're teaching students, and we're drawing attention to the grammatical forms that are embedded in those functions of language.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Connie, let's move to another topic. What verb tenses do kids need to master at the different proficiency levels?
All right, the verb system is probably the one part of speech that is the most difficult for students to internalize. And it's interesting because we know what students are learning in terms of functions and grammar or form at each of the proficiency levels. We can isolate those verb tenses so that you can have a better understanding of how they move through the various tenses. You can see on this clock, we'll let this be our verb clock, that we have it divided into 5 pieces, and each of those pieces represents a different proficiency level, a different proficiency level for our students. So where there's the Roman numeral 1, we're talking about beginners. Where there's Roman numeral 2, we're talking about early intermediates. When we see Roman numeral 3, that's for our intermediates. And then after 6 p.m., we have the level 4, which is our early advanced, and then the advanced. Now, if you look over at Roman numeral 1, our beginners, when they're at that particular level, they are developing understanding and comprehension. So they're exposed to a lot of commands, which they just have to physically respond to. But when they actually start speaking, we introduce them to the present progressive tense as well as the simple present tense. Now, as they move into level 2, because they already know the present progressive tense, we introduce them to the past progressive tense. So we've gone from, for example, is walking to was walking. In addition to that, at that tense, we also expose them to the future tense. With the future tense, they're learning either going to, what I call it the lazy way of expressing the future. I'm going to fly, I'm going to walk, I'm going to read, and so forth. They're also learning the actual future tense with the modal or auxiliary verb will. Now, it's not until level 3 or the intermediate level where students are actually interfacing frequently with the past tense, the simple past tense. But we have a lot of irregular verbs in the past tense, so it takes time to develop accuracy on the part of students for the past tense. We also expose them to the modals, would, could, should, will, can, and so forth, in addition to the present perfect tense. I have read, I have written, he has walked, and so forth. Now, you can see that if you put together levels 1, 2, and 3, if we stopped at that point in terms of providing language support for students, we've only exposed them to the simple present, past, and future tenses, and we've only exposed them to the present and the past progressive tenses, in addition to the present perfect. But when you think about the kind of language they're going to encounter in text in terms of verb form constructions, it's going to be much more complex. So if you look at the early advanced and the advanced, that's where students are going to have further exposure to the past perfect, the future progressive tense, and then of course the present and past perfect tenses, in addition to experiencing language in the passive rather than the active voice. So you can see that students are going to need a great deal of help to be able to understand the different verb tenses beyond the intermediate level, and they're going to need lots and lots of exposure and direct instruction, explicit instruction, in terms of really being able to command those verb tenses. There's no question that we have to continue to provide language support to our students after level 3, because that's where they plateau. That's where they kind of get stuck in the mud.
That makes it real clear to me the challenge facing the teacher in the classroom. It sounds like it's very complicated and it's not easy.
It's difficult for the teacher, but I'm also very empathetic to the student, because it is a very daunting task to try to develop the full range of proficiency in a second language. Language, as you say, is complicated, it's multifaceted, and so it requires lots and lots of time on the part of the student and very careful instruction on the part of the teacher to be able to move students forward to full proficiency.